I built your life. I deserve half of everything. Those words kept echoing in my head as I sat in the courthouse parking lot, gripping the steering wheel of my old Ford pickup. After 22 years of marriage, my wife had just stood before a judge and claimed she was entitled to $8.5 million, half of my construction company, and even the ranch my grandfather settled back in 1952. My name's Jake Coleman. I'm 51, and I had just watched the woman I married turn into someone I no longer recognized. But let me back up, because this didn't happen overnight. We met in college. I spent my summers pouring concrete and framing houses to pay for engineering classes. Melissa was studying journalism back then, always able to make even dull stories sound interesting. When I dragged myself home covered in dust and sweat, she looked at me with pride. She said it was honest work, real work. That was 24 years ago. That woman's gone now. The cracks started showing about 8 months before the courthouse scene. It was a Tuesday morning on the Riverside Shopping Center project in Cheyenne. I was standing there in my hard hat, staring at a problem that was about to eat into both our time and budget. The crew had hit a thick shale layer nobody expected. "Boss, what do you want us to do?" asked Jimmy Rodriguez, my lead operator. Kid was 23, a good worker, but he looked like this was the end of the world. "Well, I'll be damned, Jimmy. We've dealt with shale before," I told him. "Get the hydraulic breaker. It'll cost $800 a day, but it'll save us 3 days of handwork." Sometimes you spend money to save time. That's construction in a nutshell. Every morning throws a problem at you, and you figure out a way through before lunch. No sitting around wondering, what if? You just fix it. I've been at this for 25 years. Started Coleman Construction right out of high school with nothing more than a beat-up truck and a toolbox from my dad. Grew it from small home jobs into major commercial builds all across Wyoming. 45 employees now, pulling in about $12 million a year. Not bad for a ranch kid from outside Casper. The crew got back to work, and then my phone rang. "Melissa, Jake, I think we should update our insurance policies," she said. "Make sure everything's covered." "Why now?" I asked. "I just want to be sure we're protected." "By the way, how much depreciation do you claim on the excavators?" In 22 years of marriage, Melissa had never once asked about depreciation. She knew I made good money, but business talk always bored her. She'd change the subject any time I brought it up. "About 40 grand a year per machine," I said, wary. "And how many do you own outright?" "6. "Melissa, what's this really about?" "I'm just trying to understand your work better." You never explained the financial side. Something about her tone didn't sit right. But I had a job to run, so I said we'd talk later. That night, after a 12-hour day, I walked into the kitchen. Melissa was cooking like usual, but there was a notepad open beside her. She'd never taken notes on anything I said in all our years. "What's with a notepad?" I asked. "Just trying to understand your work better," she replied, then started peppering me with questions. Number of active projects, equipment values, business account balances. For a woman who once said construction talk put her to sleep, she suddenly couldn't get enough of it. "Since when do you care about excavators and margins?" I asked. "I've been married to you 22 years, Jake. Maybe it's time I finally understood what you do." But it wasn't curiosity in her voice. It was calculation, like she was studying for a test I didn't know existed. Friday night was poker night, same crew for the past decade. Tony Ricci, my foreman of 18 years, Bill Crawford, my banker since college, and Ray Sullivan, the equipment dealer. Over cards, I mentioned Melissa's sudden questions. "What kind of questions?" Bill asked carefully. "Detailed. Depreciation schedules, account balances. Stuff she's never cared about before." Tony set his cards down. "Jake, when my ex started asking about equipment values, I thought she was finally taking an interest in my work. 6 months later, her lawyer knew my assets better than my accountant. Come on, Tony, not everything's about your divorce. I'm just saying, brother. When a wife suddenly cares about money she ignored for 20 years, it's usually not for a good reason." Bill looked at me and said quietly, "Want me to review how your accounts are structured?" "Just to make sure you're protected." "Protected from what?" "From whatever might be coming," he said. I won that hand, but I couldn't focus on the next 3. Melissa's questions. Tony's warning. They wouldn't leave my mind. Maybe I was overreacting, but 25 years in construction trains you to notice when something feels unstable. The following week, I came home early. I'd forgotten blueprints needed for a morning meeting and walked into my home office to find Melissa rifling through my filing cabinet, snapping photos of contracts with her phone. "What are you doing?" I asked. She jumped like I'd caught her in the act. "I was looking for our tax documents. Thought I'd organize them," she lied. "Tax documents are in the safe," I told her. "They always have been." She said she thought there might be copies here. Copies of what exactly? She gave me that look that suggested I was being paranoid. "Don't be so paranoid, Jake. I'm just trying to help." But she wasn't helping. She was secretly photographing my business contracts while standing in my office and lying about it to my face. That night, lying next to the woman I'd been married to for 22 years, I realized something important had shifted between us. The woman who once beamed at my concrete-stained hands was now documenting every dollar I earned. After that, I started watching more closely, and what I discovered terrified me. The next morning, I called Greg Palmer, my business lawyer of 12 years, a straight shooter who understood construction. "Greg, I think Melissa's planning something. What should I do?" I told him about the questions, the notepad, the photos. There was a long silence on his end. "How long before she can file and freeze everything?" he asked. "Freeze everything?" I repeated. "In Wyoming, she could file tomorrow. Once those papers are served, the court can freeze assets, stop transfers, and lock things down until settlement." It hit me like a slap. "How are my business assets structured now?" he asked. "What do you mean, structured? Legally? Is everything in your name personally, or do you have corporate protections?" "It's just Coleman Construction." "Own it. Melissa and I are married, so I guess she owns half." Another pause. "Jake, we need to meet today. And don't tell anyone, especially not Melissa." That afternoon, I drove to Greg's downtown Cheyenne office. Papers were spread across his desk, and he wore that serious lawyer look. He explained that under Wyoming law, a spouse is entitled to half of marital property acquired during the marriage, which could include my business, equipment, and real estate. If she filed, she could claim half of Coleman Construction. "Unless we restructure things now, while you're still married and it's your decision," he said. He laid out a plan: form Coleman Holdings LLC, move the valuable assets into it, and make Coleman Construction the operating company. The real worth would be held in the holding company, controlled by a family trust. "What about the ranch?" I asked. "That ranch, 160 acres outside Casper, homesteaded by my grandfather in 1952, meant everything to me. My dad taught me to drive on that road. We replaced every fence post together. It wasn't just land. It was 4 generations of Coleman history." Greg said we could put the ranch into the family trust with a clause limiting inheritance to blood relatives. If the marriage ended without children, it would eventually pass to my nephew's kids in Colorado. The land might be worth about $300,000 as raw acreage, but as family legacy, it was priceless, and I wasn't about to let Melissa turn it into cash. "How long will this take?" I asked. 2 to 3 weeks, Greg said. Then he warned, "If Melissa is planning what I suspect she is, timing is everything. Once she files, it's too late to shield anything." I signed the paperwork that day. Greg promised to take care of everything quietly and keep it between us until the new structures were set up. Walking out of his office felt like prepping for a war I wasn't sure would happen, but after 25 years of fixing problems, I know it's smarter to patch the roof before the rain starts. Over the next few weeks, I watched Melissa more closely. She was taking furtive phone calls in the other room and always hanging up when I came in. She started going out to lunch more, claiming she was meeting friends I'd never heard of. "Who's Sandra again?" I asked when she mentioned one lunch. "From my book club," she said, annoyed. I thought the book club met on Thursdays. This was just a lunch thing. Her irritation made it clear she didn't like being questioned. I wasn't interrogating, just asking normal questions, but everything felt charged now, like walking through a minefield where one wrong step could blow my life apart. The worst part was suspecting Kyle Warren, my business partner of 14 years. Kyle ran the architectural side. He'd been through downturns, missed deadlines, and even helped carry my dad's casket. Now I started wondering if he was in on whatever Melissa was planning. During a planning meeting, he asked about cash flow for the next quarter. Normal enough, but he'd never cared about cash flow before. That had always been my area. Then I noticed he'd been staying late at the office a lot. One night I returned for blueprints and found his truck still in the lot. I slipped in the back and heard him on the phone in his office. The equipment valuations are in the files, he said, and the real money's in long-term contracts and client relationships. Once we get the client list and bonding capacity, we can undercut him on bids. He laughed and said, once this is over, we'll have everything we need to start our own operation. Better than Coleman Construction ever was. I backed out and drove home with my hands shaking. Kyle, my partner for years, the man who'd helped at my father's funeral, was plotting to steal the company. And from the conversation, he wasn't acting alone. When I got home, Melissa was in the living room watching TV, asking about my day like nothing was wrong. But I saw her differently now. I wondered if Kyle had been talking to her, and everything she'd been asking about, contracts, equipment values, fell into a new ominous pattern. That night, I lay beside the woman I'd married for 22 years and realized I didn't know her anymore. I didn't know what she was planning or who with, but I knew I would be ready. The next morning, I called Greg Palmer again. How fast can you get those legal structures in place? I asked. I can have everything filed by Friday, he said. I felt the clock ticking. Greg had recommended Patricia Russo, a former police detective turned private investigator who specialized in financial fraud. I hired her to dig. I'll need about 3 weeks to give you the full picture, she told me at our first meeting. But based on what you've described, you're smart to ask questions. When spouses build cases that carefully, they've usually been thinking about it far longer than you realize. While Patricia worked, I kept my routine. Up at 5:30, coffee, news, then off to the job site. But I watched everything differently. Every phone call Melissa took in the other room, every mysterious lunch, every question Kyle asked. The hardest thing was pretending normalcy around Kyle. We'd hunted together, shared plans, and he'd been there at family milestones. Betrayals that come from friends with history hurt the worst. 3 weeks later, Patricia called. Meet me at my office this afternoon. You're not going to like what I found. Her office was nothing fancy, but her face said she'd uncovered exactly what I hired her to find. Your wife has been planning this divorce for 14 months, she told me. Patricia laid out everything she'd found. Meetings with 3 different lawyers, consultations with 2 private investigators, and a forensic accountant who values businesses. 14 months? The earliest record was from March of the previous year, which meant she'd been building a case against me before my father even died. That blew me apart. My dad had passed in January. I'd spent months grieving and settling his estate. While I was handling funeral plans and transferring the ranch into my name, Melissa was quietly plotting to take it all. The woman who'd gripped my hand at my father's graveside was already figuring out how to steal his legacy. Patricia slid a folder across the desk. Hotel receipts, restaurant bills, photos of Melissa and Kyle together where they thought no one would spot them. Seeing a picture of them laughing over dinner in Laramie made me understand. They weren't just trying to take my company, they were celebrating the plan. Kyle had been supplying her with confidential business documents, financials, client contracts, equipment valuations, and projections, everything she'd need to build a divorce claim. She photographed your insurance policies, Patricia said. She knows which equipment can be sold and for how much. I sat there, hands trembling so badly I could barely hold my coffee. My wife and my partner were arranging my ruin while I assumed we were working through ordinary marriage problems. Patricia had followed them to 3 hotels over 2 months. Kyle paid cash for rooms but used his card at restaurants afterward. Sloppy. Their intent was clear. After the settlement, Melissa would have the money, and Kyle would bring the architectural skills and client relationships to start a competing outfit. I asked if Kyle had violated the partnership agreement. Patricia answered yes. By sharing confidential information, he'd breached his fiduciary duty. That gave me grounds to fire him immediately. I drove out to the ranch that evening to get away from the house where Melissa might be listening. The ranch had always been where I sorted my head, the land my grandfather and father had worked for decades. Standing on the porch of my grandfather's old cabin, looking over pastures cultivated by 3 generations, I felt the weight of what they were planning, taking the ranch and using it to finance a new life together. That's when I made a choice. I called Greg Palmer. Greg, they want everything. Let's give them exactly what they ask for. There was silence on the line. Greg warned that the plan could backfire. If the legal restructuring failed, I might still lose everything. I told him doing nothing guaranteed loss. By agreeing up front, I'd control the outcome. Then I explained my reasoning. Melissa and Kyle had been building their attack for over a year, but they had done it with a map that only showed half the territory. They believed Coleman Construction was the treasure chest, visible from the outside with all its equipment, projects, and reputation tied neatly to my name. What they didn't know was that the chest had already been emptied and its contents stored elsewhere. Coleman Holdings LLC now owned the heavy machinery, the lucrative client contracts, the valuable parcels of real estate. The Coleman Family Trust controlled the ranch. On paper, Coleman Construction still existed, but it was little more than a shell, an operating arm without the heart of the company. Melissa thought she was playing chess, carefully planning her moves, but she didn't know the other half of the board existed. When the court awarded her half of Coleman Construction, she would discover the company held far less than she imagined. The bulldozers, the trucks, the office building, the very contracts that generated cash flow, all of it was already protected. And the ranch? That was beyond her reach entirely. It had been written into the trust that only a blood relative could inherit it. Even if I wanted to give it to her, the law said I couldn't. That land was locked in the Coleman name forever. Greg warned me the plan was risky. If a judge thought I was hiding assets, it could all unravel. But nothing had been hidden. Every transfer was legal, above board, and documented months before divorce was ever on the table. I told him I wasn't trying to cheat anyone. I was simply protecting my family's legacy, the same way any careful businessman would. The next morning, the storm hit. The divorce papers were delivered at the job site while I was in the trailer with Tony Ricci, reviewing schedules. The process server asked my name, handed me the thick envelope, and walked away without another word. Tony watched my face as I opened it. Melissa's demands were laid out in black and white: $8.5 million, half of Coleman Construction, the ranch, and $12,000 a month in support for 8 years. She had calculated everything she thought existed, right down to the penny. Tony asked if it was bad news. I shook my head. This is exactly what I was expecting. When he pressed, I told him sometimes the best way to win is to let the other side think they're winning until it's too late to change their strategy. Melissa and Kyle had been scheming for more than a year, but their plan was based on taking something that no longer belonged to me. That afternoon, I called Greg and told him to prepare our official response. We would give Melissa everything she demanded, every dollar, every acre, every piece of the company she thought she was seizing. Then we'd let the truth catch up to her. On the day of the final hearing, the courtroom was packed. Melissa arrived dressed for victory, in a sleek black dress that probably cost a month's wages for most people. Her attorney, Walsh, had flown in from Denver with a practice swagger, already envisioning his percentage of her multimillion-dollar win. Melissa kept glancing at her phone, no doubt sending Kyle updates about how close they were to the finish line. When the judge called our case, Walsh launched into his performance. He painted Melissa as the loyal wife who had sacrificed everything for my success, who had built my life alongside me, and who now deserved her rightful half. When Judge Andrews asked if I contested any of her demands, the room held its breath. "No, Your Honor," I said evenly. I agreed to all of them. The reaction was immediate. Melissa's head whipped toward me, eyes wide. Walsh froze mid-smirk, like someone had yanked the rug out from under him. Even Greg, who knew this was the plan, looked momentarily taken aback by the delivery. "You agree to the $8.5 million settlement?" the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor." "Half of Coleman Construction?" "Yes, Your Honor." "The ranch property?" "Yes, Your Honor." Melissa's smile returned, bright and triumphant. Kyle, sitting a few rows back, looked like a man about to sign his biggest deal yet. Walsh scribbled furiously, no doubt calculating his massive payday. Judge Andrews reviewed the terms one final time, then signed the decree. "Mr. Coleman, you have 60 days to comply with the property transfers and financial settlement," he said. That's when I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. "Your Honor, I have one more document for the record." Inside was the real story. The corporate paperwork showing Coleman Holdings controlled the assets, the trust documents for the ranch, and Patricia's detailed investigative report outlining Melissa and Kyle's year-long betrayal. The judge read in silence for several minutes while the courtroom grew tense. Walsh's confidence bled out of him. Melissa's victorious smile began to falter. Finally, Judge Andrews looked up. "Mr. Coleman, it appears the assets your wife has been awarded may not be accessible in the manner she anticipated." "That's correct, Your Honor," I said. "But I'm prepared to honor the spirit of the settlement with a revised offer." I turned directly to Melissa. "800,000 cash, and you walk away from everything else. Take it or spend the next 5 years fighting in court against structures you can't break. Melissa went pale. Walsh asked for a recess, and they disappeared for half an hour. When they returned, Melissa looked hollowed out, like the weight of her plan had collapsed on her. "Your Honor," Walsh said quietly, "my client accepts Mr. Coleman's revised offer." The judge confirmed with Melissa directly. Her voice was barely audible. "Yes, Your Honor." The empire she thought she had stolen had crumbled into dust right there in that courtroom. The papers were signed that afternoon, crisp signatures that closed one chapter of my life and opened another. 3 days later, Kyle's buyout was executed. His partnership share in Coleman Construction, which he had once bragged was worth millions in potential, came to just $45,000 at book value. That was the cold arithmetic of reality. All those client relationships he thought he could slip into his back pocket stayed exactly where they belonged, with the company, with me, and with the men who had built them. Greg handled Kyle's transaction with his usual professional calm, but I could see it in his eyes. He knew this cut deeper than numbers. It ended more than a partnership. It ended a kind of family we'd built over 14 years of late nights, hard winters, and shared victories. Kyle packed his office in silence that weekend, hauling out boxes of blueprints and personal trinkets no one cared about anymore. By Monday morning, his truck was gone, and by the end of the week, so was he. Word traveled fast in Wyoming. In this business, loyalty mattered more than design awards. No one wanted to hire an architect who had betrayed his own partner. Kyle never came back. Melissa fought harder, at least at first. She tried to contest the trust documents, hiring a new lawyer who promised her angles no one else had considered. 6 months and $60,000 in fees later, even he told her the truth. She was throwing money into a furnace she couldn't extinguish. She took what cash remained from the settlement and left for Colorado. I heard rumors she tried to launch that interior design business she and Kyle had once toasted to in dimly lit restaurants. It folded within 6 months. Money, it turns out, can buy furniture and office space, but not the grit it takes to keep the doors open when the first bills come due. Meanwhile, life moved on. The scandal, if you could call it that, faded as soon as the truth became clear. Employees relaxed, clients returned, and within the year, we landed the largest contract in company history, a hospital complex in Casper that would keep crews working steady for 2 full years. Coleman Construction didn't just survive, it grew. I found myself spending more time at the ranch. The old cabin my grandfather built had taken a beating from years of Wyoming weather, but I set about fixing it up. New roof, updated plumbing, but keeping the logs and stone foundation intact. On Friday evenings, I'd sit on the porch with a glass of bourbon, watching the sun sink over land that had belonged to my family for 70 years. That horizon carried more meaning now. It reminded me of where we came from, what we'd endured, and what we'd managed to hold on to. Tony Ricci began taking on more of the day-to-day operations. He had earned it. The crews respected him, he knew the business down to the studs, and he had the same steady fire I'd had when I was his age. Bill Crawford helped restructure the finances so that Coleman Construction was stronger than ever. Ray Sullivan still sold me equipment, still beat me at poker most Fridays, though he teased that he was cautious now, wondering what other legal maneuvers I might have tucked away. I never remarried. Some betrayals cut so deep they reshape how you see trust, how you measure loyalty. But that didn't stop me from building a good life. The business thrived, the ranch was secure, and I carried with me a lesson that mattered more than money: protect what cannot be replaced. Last month, my nephew brought his kids out for a weekend. 8 and 10 years old, they rode horses for the first time, caught trout in the creek that winds through the back 40, and asked me questions with wide-eyed curiosity. The 10-year-old wanted to know how long our family had owned the ranch. 70 years, I told him. Your great-great-grandfather homesteaded it in 1952. He asked if it would always be ours. I smiled and said, as long as there are Colemans who want it, son. That's what family land means. Tony's oldest boy had just graduated engineering school, sharp as a tack and already seasoned from summers spent working with us since he was 16. Maybe Coleman Construction would pass to him someday. Maybe it would skip a generation, but it wouldn't skip the values that had built it: hard work, loyalty, and persistence. Looking back, I realized Melissa and Kyle had made one critical mistake. They believed success was something you could steal. They thought 25 years of grit, of mistakes and recoveries, of early mornings and late nights, was just luck waiting to be taken. What they never understood was that real success isn't transferable. You can't siphon it off a balance sheet or tuck it into a duffel bag. It's built in the daily grind, in the respect you earn from people who know whether you can be counted on when it matters. I learned the line between trust and foolishness. Trust people, but verify their actions. And always protect what matters most, because if you built something worth having, someone somewhere is already scheming to take it. The job isn't just to build, it's to outthink them. People say the best revenge is getting even. I learned otherwise. The best revenge is refusing to be destroyed. When the dust settles and the people who came to take everything find you still standing, stronger, sharper, unbroken, that's not just winning. That's proof of who you are, of what you're made of. And that's worth more than all the money they ever tried to steal.